Thanks a lot for joining us on Newsnight this evening.
Thank you, Faith.
Now, this is an issue that has been growing in South Africa, especially in the African context. 4 million individuals, and the only reason we've got 4 million accounted for is because they came forward and those figures were released by the South African Depression and Anxiety Group. But how many people are suffering at home alone, not knowing that in fact they do have bipolar, or are suffering because of misdiagnosis?
You know, misdiagnosis, excuse me, misdiagnosis is rife, and ill diagnosis. There's many people that aren't diagnosed. They don't have access to public health care, which is not in a great place in South Africa. Private health care is extremely expensive. And, yeah, I mean, people are suffering. They are isolated. They are stigmatized by society. So I can't even imagine how many people right now are either languishing in a mental health institution or sitting isolated at home.
Yeah, I mean, on the other side of it, I mean, you wrote a book called Life Interrupted, and the whole purpose of Life Interrupted, and there's at the back of us there, we can see the cover of your book, a bipolar memoir in itself. It must have taken you to a very vulnerable space to open up like that about your journey with bipolar. Talk to us a little about it.
You know, it definitely is a vulnerable space to enter.
Just some water there in the meantime. Yeah.
But I think very necessary for me, in that I lived in a space of self-stigmatization where I was very hard on myself. And I felt that I had to take my story out because we need to have this dialogue. We need to talk about mental health issues. And by sharing my story, it's been amazing how people have come forward and started engaging, and the amazing situation that it is for them to share their stories off the back of me sharing mine.
Yeah, I mean, on the other side of it, I mean, Samantha, it's knowing that you are bipolar and going through the symptoms. Tell us about that. Like, what are the symptoms? How do you know? What are the telltale signs? Are there any signs that you can tell immediately that, look, I'm not okay, or there's a mental health issue and I need to deal with it, not even from a you know, just going to a psychologist, but also from a, you know, from a psychotherapist perspective, and also going through the nature of medicine if needs be?
I think one has to have a hold on one's own idea in terms of recognizing symptoms. Triggers are important. Any kind of external stressor that might push you into a place of stress or dis-ease can be a trigger. For example, the death of a loved one, a loss of a relationship, and in any kind of stressful situation, sexual assault. The impact of such things triggers. Substance abuse is certainly a trigger. And then the symptoms present. The illness actually presents in distorted behaviors, which make it very difficult for people to react to on the outside, because if you are hypersexualized, which is one of the symptoms, you appear to be kind of behaving in a very thank you, negative manner towards other people. And this symptom is part of the illness. Aggression is part of the illness. In the depressive stage, it's kind of dropping out, not appearing at work, you know, personal hygiene breaking. So bipolar is a fluctuation of moods. It's bipolar 1. It is a manic experience which is very energetic. It's kind of feeling of self-righteousness, unbounded, and then it drops into depression, which is pure isolation.
Very high in the sense that, and I remember because, you know, individuals will speak about, and a lot of doctors will speak about how the high is so high that you could buy a car, and the high is so high that you could buy a house. So logic almost, it's still there, but logic, your euphoria precedes, it's a constant state of euphoria, precedes the actual high in itself. And then on the other side of it, low is low, so low that the darkness sometimes can be overwhelming.
Well, myself, I have purchased a house.
Really?
And got into a lot of trouble, lost a deposit of substantial funds. And this is a problem I find with my clients in my bipolar coaching practice, whereby there's this incredible expenditure and people don't have the money, they're cash in investments. Luckily for myself, I was saved in that respect. In depression, I've tried to commit suicide. So these are the extreme edges that you can go to with this illness, which is why it is so crucial to manage this illness, and it is manageable.
Yeah. Let's talk about, how manageable it is and what must individuals do to manage it. I mean, first of all, before we even go to this issue around managing it, is how do I know? Let's just be basic here. I wake up in the morning, how do I know that this is not okay? I'm not going through a mood swing. I'm not going through just a sad phase, because everybody is sad at one stage of their life or another, that it's not just sadness, it's not just anger, it's not just frustration, it's not just moodiness, that there's actually something mentally wrong with me. How do you detect?
Very unfortunately, one actually most often cannot detect it. It's a very peculiar kind of surge of energy, and because you get kind of a huge amount of energy and you stop eating and you stop sleeping, it feels like a kind of awakening almost. You just get this sort of new perspective on life, and it's difficult actually to notice, and unfortunately it's a runaway train to the point where suddenly that train the signals are misfiring and there's going to be a crash. So it really requires support of the loved one.
So loved ones must be able to tell that this is not, example, the buying of the house, that
yes.
under normal circumstances, Samantha will not be getting up in the morning on a random Wednesday and decide, tell you what I'm going to do on this Wednesday, I'm going to buy a house.
Well, I wouldn't tell you, and that's the problem.
Sure.
I would have gone ahead, as I did, on my own and withdrawn my savings and done it. There's a lot of kind of troubleshooting for the loved one and family. It's very, very stressful for the loved one. But, it is the loved one from the outside perspective who can identify, like she hasn't phoned, she's kind of not answering the calls, not answering the doorbell, not going to work, kind of being overly active on Facebook, sort of meeting anyone and engaging with anyone. So there are signs that the loved one or the external other has to notice and has to act upon. But the person suffering from bipolar will resist, because they go into a place of perceived persecution from the outside world, because it is such an isolating experience. You feel the oncoming, and there is a lot of resistance to help.
I'm just thinking of children in school, and high school especially, and I mean, we've seen some cases, and recently even, of young people committing suicide, and young people even in school committing suicide. We go through it every single January or end of December when matric results come out. And now the question becomes for educators, empowering educators with that knowledge. How does an educator spot or see that the child or a pupil in their class, it's not just, as I said, it's not just sadness, it's not just aggression, that there's actually a mental health issue that needs to be dealt with, because that's where you spend 8 hours of your day at school.
Which is why this time frame is so useful, and educators absolutely, I mean, they should be offered the opportunity of information. The child who retracts, stops talking in class, stops sitting with their friends at break, stops handing in homework, is very timid, doesn't speak out. This is a child with a risk around possible depression. And again, unfortunately, we don't have school psychologists in many of our schools, so it's difficult. And the child will not want to speak out, and possibly at home, they are also just going straight home into their bedroom. In terms of kind of manifesting in a manic a kind of extreme energy is going to be picked up, distorted, kind of behavior in a classroom, disruptive behavior will be picked up. But I think educators are key identifiers for children.
It makes you think of the surge. Remember when schools used to identify children as having ADHD at one stage, and so retin was almost prescribed to every single child. Any child that is seen to be disruptive in any way or overly talkative, and it does not necessarily mean that it's ADHD. It could actually be bipolar, or it could just be a child needing that extra care from an educator's perspective.
Well, there is research to support this idea that ADD is a precursor to bipolar later on in life. However, the diagnosis of bipolar is happening much younger, around 14 years old now. My diagnosis happened at 18 years old.
Sure. And let's talk a little bit about managing. How do I if it's a person that's living with bipolar, or if you're a loved one and you can sense that someone in my family has got bipolar, how do you manage, and how do you offer the support and the help that that individual needs?
Well, I would suggest you speak kindly to that person. I think compassion plays a huge role in all of this. I think to sit with a person and to assist a person, just to take over some daily roles, you know, to assist them with the bathing and the showering and make sure that they're eating, make sure they're resting as often, and then to reach out to organizations. There are free counseling services, there are many helplines, and then to engage in support groups. There are support groups for loved ones and friends of people suffering with bipolar. And then in terms of management, ultimately you have to take responsibility. There kind of is a bit of a misconception that the world needs to destigmatize, but actually you also have to destigmatize as a sufferer of bipolar. And you have to take responsibility for the management of your illness. You have to take your meds, you have to see a counselor, you have to engage in good nutrition, some good exercise, some sociability, and you have to avoid substance abuse.
Yeah. I'm just thinking, even especially when it comes to the stigma that is existing within African communities, there's still that stigma around, you know, if a person is, for example, schizophrenic, they'll just automatically assume that they'll label that person crazy instead of actually going into what mental health issue does that person have. So still a lot of stigma that exists. And I'm sure there are, figures to suggest that, especially in the African community, there are various individuals that suffer from bipolar, but will either say, look, I need to go see a traditional healer, or I need to do or go through a certain ritualistic path where actually that individual has got a mental health disorder that needs to be managed with the care, with the right medicine, so that indeed they can overcome it.
You know, most people in this country consult a traditional healer for their healthcare needs. So I think that we need to engage in the conversation. I think the Western idea of allopathic psychopharmaceutical treatment has got its place, certainly. It saved my life, and I've seen it throughout South Africans. However, the traditional healers and the psychiatrists need to meet, need to thrash it out, and need to have a holistic understanding of treatment. And the spiritual aspect of life is very real for people. There is spirit. And we need to understand the role of spirit in our lives. But I am calling for that conversation.
How has it been received so far? Are people coming to the party, or traditional leaders coming to the party in terms of that kind of a conversation? Because again, it's not working outside of each other, but it's working together for specifically mental health, especially around mental health issues, because those are the issues that go undiagnosed for a very long time. Those are the issues that a person ends up committing suicide when the person could have just gotten the necessary help that they need. So are traditional healers coming to the party to actually have this conversation, which is 4 million is a lot, and that's just 4 million documented people.
I don't think the opportunity has really been kind of teased out yet, and I don't think I haven't as of yet been able to create that platform, but it is certainly an intention to do so.
Samantha, thanks a lot for joining us. I think that it's very insightful and very brave of you to come out and write Life Uninterrupted as you share your memoirs and share your experiences with bipolar. Hopefully somebody will get the necessary help that they need and see that it's actually not a secret, that they can get help indeed. Is this available? The book is available at bookstores?
Yes, at all leading bookstores.
All leading bookstores. That is exactly where you can find Life Interrupted by Samantha Smirin there. It is a bipolar memoir and really written truthfully and authentically just about life with bipolar, manageable mental health, and of course I'm looking at encouraging more conversations around mental health issues.